Some nights change everything. This was one of them. What started as another quiet evening shift at Meridian Tower became the moment that would redefine not just my life, but the life of a woman I'd never spoken to and my 8-year-old son, who was sleeping peacefully at home, unaware that his father was about to become someone completely different. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Rivera, and for the past 18 months, I've been the night security guard at Meridian Tower, a gleaming 30-story office complex in downtown Seattle. The job isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me home during the day with my son Diego. Most nights pass in comfortable solitude, walking the empty corridors, checking locks, and monitoring security feeds from my station in the marble-lined lobby. The building houses everything from tech startups to law firms, and by 9 p.m., it's usually as quiet as a library. That Tuesday in October started like any other. The autumn rain was drumming against the floor-to-ceiling windows as I settled into my routine, reviewing the day's visitor logs and checking the overnight maintenance schedule. Diego had fallen asleep earlier while I helped him with his math homework, his small hand still clutching the pencil he'd been using to practice multiplication tables. Being a single father wasn't what I'd planned, but after Maria's sudden death in a car accident 2 years ago, it became my only plan. Everything I did now revolved around making sure Diego felt safe, loved, and never had to worry about losing the only parent he had left. The first sign something was wrong came at 10:47 p.m. The front entrance buzzer rang, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes employees forgot their key cards or had to return for forgotten items. But when I looked at the security monitor, I saw a woman I didn't recognize standing in the rain without an umbrella, her designer coat soaked through. She was pressing the buzzer repeatedly, her movements sharp with panic. I'd seen her before, though never up close. She arrived every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m. in a black Tesla, always impeccably dressed, always walking with the confident stride of someone who owned whatever space she occupied. She never made eye contact with the security desk, never needed to sign in like other visitors, and her key card gave her access to the restricted elevator that served only the top 3 floors. I'd assumed she was some high-level executive, maybe a partner at one of the law firms upstairs. Through the intercom, her voice was strained but controlled. "Please, I need to get inside. There's someone following me." I could hear the rain intensifying behind her words, and something else, the unmistakable edge of genuine fear. Protocol dictated that I should ask for identification and verify her reason for being there so late. But protocol hadn't prepared me for the way she kept glancing over her shoulder into the dark street, or how her hands shook as she held them up to the camera. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts, and every instinct I developed as a father, as a man who'd learned to recognize when someone was in real danger, told me to open that door. "Come in," I said, hitting the release button, quickly. She pushed through the entrance like someone fleeing a fire, water dripping from her auburn hair onto the polished stone floor. In the bright lobby lighting, I could see that her pale complexion had gone even whiter, and she kept looking back toward the street through the glass doors. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of refined features that suggested she'd never had to worry about much. Until tonight. "Thank you," she breathed, wrapping her arms around herself. "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's a man. He's been following me from my car, and I couldn't get to the parking garage safely." Before I could respond, I saw him. A figure emerged from the shadows across the street, moving with the predatory patience of someone who had all night to wait. He positioned himself under a streetlight where he'd have a clear view of the lobby, making no attempt to hide his presence. The message was clear: I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, moving around from behind the security desk to get a better view of the street. 3 weeks, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe longer. At first, I thought it was coincidental, seeing the same person at the coffee shop, at the grocery store. But then he started showing up at my apartment building, at restaurants where I was meeting friends. Tonight, he followed me from the parking garage at Pike Place Market. I've been driving around for an hour, trying to lose him, but he's persistent. I studied the man across the street more carefully. Mid-40s, average height, wearing dark clothes that helped him blend into the urban landscape. He had the patient stillness of someone who'd done this before, someone who understood that. Stalking was a game of endurance. The way he positioned himself showed he was smart enough to stay on public property, just far enough away to avoid immediate legal consequences, but close enough to maintain psychological pressure. Have you called the police? I asked, though. I suspected I knew the answer. She shook her head, frustration flickering across her features. What am I supposed to tell them? That someone keeps appearing in the same public places I do? That I have a feeling I'm being watched? He hasn't actually threatened me, hasn't violated any restraining order. The officers I spoke with last week were polite but clear that until he does something overtly illegal, their hands are tied. This was the reality that too many women faced. The legal system required evidence of concrete threats or actions, but stalkers had learned to operate in the gray areas, to terrorize their victims through presence and persistence rather than overt aggression. The psychological impact was devastating, but proving it in court was nearly impossible. What's your name? I asked, pulling out my security log to document the incident. Sarah, she said, then paused as if deciding whether to trust me with more. Sarah Chun. I work upstairs in the building. I wrote down her name and the time, noting the presence of the suspicious individual outside. Standard protocol would have been to advise her to contact police and perhaps offer to escort her to her car when she felt ready to leave. But looking at Sarah Chun, seeing the way her hands trembled despite her attempts to maintain composure, I knew standard protocol wasn't going to be enough. Here's what we're going to do, I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I'd once used in very different circumstances. I'm going to call this into Seattle PD, create an official record of the incident. Then I'm going to walk you to your car and make sure you get home safely. And I want you to have my direct number, so if this happens again, you can call me immediately. Relief flooded her features, the first genuine emotion I'd seen break through her carefully maintained control. You would do that? I mean, is that part of your job responsibilities? The question caught me off guard, not because it was unreasonable, but because it reminded me how alone she must feel in this situation. Sometimes being responsible for people's safety goes beyond what's written in a job description, I said. Nobody should have to deal with this alone. As I picked up the phone to call the police, I caught sight of Sarah's reflection in the lobby windows. She was studying me with a curious expression, as if trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't expected to encounter. For a moment, our eyes met in the glass, and I saw something shift in her gaze. Not just gratitude, but recognition of something she couldn't quite place. The man across the street hadn't moved, but his posture had changed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was no longer casually observing. He was watching me specifically, calculating this new variable in whatever sick game he'd been playing with Sarah's peace of mind. I'd dealt with predators before, in contexts far more dangerous than a Seattle office building, and I recognized the moment when they realized their victim was no longer isolated. Officer Martinez, this is Marcus Rivera at Meridian Tower, I said when the dispatcher connected me to a patrol unit. I have a woman here who's being stalked, and the suspect is currently positioned across the street from our building. I need someone to document this incident, and possibly do a welfare check on the individual in question. As I provided details to the officer, I kept one eye on Sarah and another on the figure outside. She had moved closer to the security desk, seeking the psychological shelter of proximity to someone who was willing to help. But there was something else in her posture now, a kind of professional assessment that seemed at odds with her earlier vulnerability. "The officer will be here in about 10 minutes, I told her after ending the call. "In the meantime, why don't you have a seat and I'll get you some coffee? It's going to be a long night, but we'll make sure you get through it safely." She nodded, settling into one of the leather chairs arranged near the security station. "Marcus," she said, testing my name as if trying to remember where she might have heard it before. "Have we met? There's something familiar about you, but I can't place it." The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us fully understood yet. Outside, the stalker remained at his post, unaware that he'd chosen the wrong building, the wrong night, and most importantly, the wrong person to terrorize. This was about to become a very different kind of confrontation than he'd planned. But Sarah Chun had no idea that the night security guard she'd turned to for help wasn't just someone doing his job. She had no idea that the man making coffee and calling police on her behalf was someone whose background would have shocked her, someone who'd been rejected from working in this very building under very different circumstances. And I had no idea that the frightened woman seeking protection in my lobby was about to change everything I thought I knew about my place in the world. The coffee I poured for Sarah was terrible, the kind of bitter institutional brew that had been sitting in the pot since my shift started. But she accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the ceramic mug as if drawing warmth from more than just the liquid inside. While we waited for the police, I found myself studying her more carefully than I'd ever allowed myself to before during those brief morning encounters. Up close, Sarah Chun possessed a quiet intelligence that went beyond her obvious professional success. The way she observed her surroundings, cataloging details and assessing situations, reminded me of the analytical approach I'd once used in very different circumstances. Her questions weren't random or panicked despite her fear. She wanted to understand the building's security protocols, how long response times typically were, whether this kind of incident had happened before. "You're very calm for someone in security," she said, settling back into the leather chair. "Most guards I've encountered seem either bored or overly aggressive. You have this way of making people feel safe without making them feel helpless." The observation was more perceptive than she probably realized. "I have some experience with crisis situations," I said carefully, "and I have a son. Being a parent teaches you how to project calm even when you're worried. How old is your son?" 8, Diego. He's probably dreaming about soccer, right now, completely oblivious to the fact that his dad is having the most interesting night he's had in months. A genuine smile crossed Sarah's features for the first time since she'd entered the lobby. I remember being 8. The world felt so much simpler then. Your biggest worry was whether you'd remembered to bring your lunch money, or if there would be dodgeball in pay. Diego's current crisis involves a girl in his class named Emma, who apparently thinks his backpack is totally awesome, but won't talk to him directly. Third-grade romance is apparently more complicated than international diplomacy. Smart kid having good taste in backpacks. That's clearly inherited from his father's excellent judgment. The easy rapport that developed between us felt natural despite the circumstances. Sarah had the kind of conversational intelligence that made you forget you just met her, and I found myself sharing more than I typically would with someone I barely knew. But there was something else happening beneath the surface of our interaction, a recognition that neither of us could quite articulate. Through the lobby windows, I kept monitoring the stalker's position. He'd moved slightly, repositioning himself near a bus stop that gave him better sight lines while maintaining plausible deniability. The man was patient and calculating, which made him more dangerous than someone acting on impulse. I'd encountered similar predatory behavior before, in contexts where the stakes were considerably higher than a Seattle office building. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Earlier, when you told me what we were going to do, you sounded like someone who'd given orders before. Like someone who was used to being in charge during dangerous situations." The question hit closer to home than I was comfortable with. I suppose all parents develop that tone eventually. You learn to sound authoritative when your kid is about to run into traffic or touch something hot. "That wasn't a parental tone," she said quietly. "That was something else entirely." Before I could respond, the police arrived. Officer Martinez was a veteran patrol cop in her 40s, someone who'd clearly dealt with stalking cases before and understood their psychological complexity. She took Sarah's statement with professional thoroughness, documenting dates, locations, and behavioral patterns with the kind of detail that might prove useful if the situation escalated to legal action. "The individual across the street is still there," Officer Martinez noted after reviewing my incident report. "I'm going to have a conversation with him, establish his identity and his reasons for being in this location at this hour." We watched through the lobby windows as Officer Martinez approached the stalker. Even from a distance, his body language shifted dramatically when confronted by law enforcement. The casual confidence he'd projected while watching Sarah evaporated, replaced by the nervous energy of someone who knew he was operating in legal gray areas. "He's scared," Sarah observed. "Look how his posture changed the moment she started talking to him." "Predators usually are when they're confronted directly," I said. "They prefer to operate from the shadows, maintaining control through fear and uncertainty. Direct confrontation destroys their psychological advantage." Sarah turned to look at me sharply. "You sound like you know a lot about predatory behavior." "I read a lot," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded inadequate. Officer Martinez returned after about 10 minutes, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes holding the frustration that came with dealing with someone who was technically doing nothing illegal. "His name is Derek Paulson," she reported. "He claims he was waiting for a friend who works in one of the restaurants down the block. Says he didn't realize his presence was causing anyone distress. I've advised him that loitering in this area might be considered harassment, and he's agreed to move along for tonight. Will that actually stop him?" Sarah asked. "Probably not permanently," Officer Martinez admitted. "But it establishes a paper trail. If he continues this behavior, we'll have documentation of prior warnings, which strengthens any future restraining order applications. I'd recommend varying your routines, parking in different locations, and maintaining a detailed log of any future encounters." After the officer left, Sarah and I watched Derek Paulson disappear into the Seattle night. But his absence didn't bring the relief I'd expected. Instead, it felt like a temporary reprieve, the eye of a storm rather than its resolution. "He'll be back," Sarah said, voicing what we were both thinking. "Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. He's invested too much time in this game to give up after one police conversation." "Then we'll be ready for him," I said with more confidence than I felt. "We?" She studied my face with that same puzzling expression of half-recognition. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. What did you do before this job?" The question hung between us like a challenge. I'd spent 18 months perfecting the art of deflection, of being friendly but not too familiar, helpful but not too involved. The security guard persona I'd created was designed to be forgettable, someone who blended into the background of other people's important lives. But Sarah Chun wasn't going to accept deflection. There was something in her eyes that suggested she was accustomed to getting answers to questions that mattered to her. "I was in the military," I said finally, offering just enough truth to satisfy curiosity without opening doors I wasn't ready to walk through. "What branch? Army, Special Forces?" How long? 12 years. And you left to become a security guard? The skepticism in her voice was justified. The career trajectory from special forces to night security didn't follow any logical progression, and Sarah was clearly intelligent enough to recognize the gaps in my story. Life circumstances. Change, I said. Maria, my wife, was diagnosed with cancer when Diego was 6. I took early retirement to be with her during treatment and to make sure Diego had stability during a difficult time. After she died, I needed work that would let me be home during the day. The explanation was true as far as it went, but it omitted crucial details about the specific nature of my military service and the professional qualifications I'd developed during those 12 years. It didn't mention the advanced training in psychological operations, crisis negotiation, and threat assessment that had made me far more than just another soldier. Sarah's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry about your wife. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was. But Diego is an amazing kid, and he deserved to have at least one parent who could be present for him. The job here pays enough to cover our expenses, the hours work with his school schedule, and it's honest work. But you're overqualified. Everyone's overqualified for something. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's certainly true. Sometimes I think the most interesting people are the ones who've had to reinvent themselves completely. There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience with reinvention. But before I could explore that observation, she stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the empty street where Derek Paulson had been stationed. I should probably head home, she said. It's getting late, and I have early meetings tomorrow. I'll walk you to your car, I said, reaching for my jacket. You don't have to do that. The police scared him off, and I'm sure he's long gone by now. Probably. But I'd feel better knowing you got to your car safely. She studied my face again with that puzzling expression of almost recognition. You know, there's something about you that reminds me of someone, but I can't place it. Have you ever applied for jobs in this building before? The question struck me like a physical blow. Why would you ask that? I don't know. You just seem familiar somehow, like maybe I've seen your resume or your application photo. I review a lot of personnel files in my work. What kind of work do you do upstairs? For the first time since she'd entered the lobby, Sarah hesitated before answering. Human resources, she said finally. I handle hiring and employee relations for several of the companies in the building. It wasn't technically a lie, but I could sense there was more to her role than she was revealing. Just as she could sense, there was more to my background that I was sharing. We gathered our things and headed toward the parking garage elevator. Two people who'd found unexpected connection during a crisis, each carrying secrets that might change everything if revealed. Neither of us realized that we were about to discover just how much our lives had been intersecting without our knowledge, or how much we both had to gain and lose from the truth. The parking garage felt different at night, shadows stretching between concrete pillars and creating dozens of potential hiding places. I found myself automatically scanning for threats, my old training asserting itself despite my current civilian status. Sarah noticed my heightened alertness and seemed to draw comfort from it, staying close as we made our way to her Tesla. Thank you, she said as she unlocked her car, for everything tonight. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been willing to help. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, she said firmly, they wouldn't have. Most people would have followed protocol, made the minimum required effort, and left it at that. You went beyond what was expected, and that matters more than you might realize. As she drove away, I stood in the parking garage for several minutes, thinking about the evening's events and the woman who disrupted my carefully ordered world. Sarah Chung was clearly more than she appeared to be, just as I was more than I appeared to be. But neither of us had any idea that our carefully guarded secrets were about to collide in ways that would transform not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us. The next morning brought an unusual disruption to my routine. Diego woke up with a fever and the kind of persistent cough that meant he wouldn't be going to school. As a single parent, sick days always presented the same dilemma: how to balance work responsibilities with the reality that an 8-year-old needed supervision and care. "Dad, my throat feels like I swallowed sandpaper," Diego croaked from his bed, his dark hair sticking up in every direction. Despite feeling miserable, he still managed to look like his mother around the eyes, that same gentle intelligence that had first drawn me to Maria years ago. "Then we'll fix that," I said, sitting on the edge of his bed and feeling his forehead. "Looks like you're staying home today, which means I need to make some phone calls about tonight's shift. Are you going to get in trouble?" Diego asked, the worry in his voice revealing how much he understood about our financial situation, despite my efforts to shield him from those concerns. "No, buddy, Mr. Patterson will understand. Sometimes being a dad means your kid comes first. And any decent boss respects that." What I didn't tell Diego was that calling in sick meant losing a night's pay we couldn't really afford, or that my supervisor at Meridian Tower was already looking for reasons to cut overtime hours. But those were adult problems, and Diego had enough to worry about with his fever and cough. After getting him settled with juice, children's medication, and his favorite animated movies, I called the building management office to request emergency coverage for my shift. The conversation with Mr. Patterson went better than expected. Apparently, the incident with Sarah Chun and Derek Paulson had been reported to building management, and my handling of the situation had earned some positive attention from the upper floors. "Take care of your son," Patterson said. "We'll manage coverage for tonight. But Rivera, I want you to know that your professionalism last night didn't go unnoticed. There might be some opportunities opening up that we should discuss when you're back." The comment intrigued me, but Diego's needs took priority over career speculation. I spent the day alternating between comfort duties, ensuring he stayed hydrated and trying to keep him entertained while his body fought off whatever bug he'd picked up at school. Around noon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Marcus, this is Sarah Chun, from last night." Her voice carried a different quality in daylight, more confident and businesslike than the frightened woman who'd sought refuge in the lobby. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I got your number from the incident report." "Not at all. Is everything okay? Has Paulson tried to contact you?" "No, nothing like that. Actually, I was calling because I wanted to thank you again, and also because I've been thinking about our conversation, specifically about your background." I felt a familiar tension in my shoulders, the automatic defensive response that came whenever anyone started probing too deeply into my history. "What about it?" "Marcus, I need to be honest with you about something. I wasn't entirely truthful last night about my role in the building. I don't just handle human resources for some of the companies upstairs." The pause stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. "I own the building," she said finally. "Meridian Tower belongs to me. Well, to my company, Chun Properties, but I'm the sole owner and CEO." The revelation hit me like cold water. Sarah Chun wasn't just another tenant or executive. She was my ultimate employer, the person whose decisions determined everything from security protocols to maintenance budgets. More importantly, she was someone with access to every personnel file, every background check, and every employment application that had ever crossed her desk. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because after you left last night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I knew you from somewhere. So I went through our employment records, both current and historical. Marcus, I found your application." My stomach dropped. The application she was referring to wasn't for a security position. It was for something entirely different, something that revealed capabilities I'd been carefully hiding behind the uniform and clipboard of a night watchman. 2 years ago, Sarah continued, you applied for the position of Director of Corporate Security and Risk Assessment. Your resume was extraordinary. 12 years in Army Special Forces, including 3 years as a psychological operations specialist. Advanced degrees in criminology and organizational psychology. Certifications in threat assessment, crisis negotiation, and corporate security management. You were the most qualified candidate we'd ever received for any position. I closed my eyes, remembering the carefully crafted application I'd submitted during Maria's final months. It had represented hope for a future where I could use my skills professionally while maintaining the stability Diego needed. The salary would have been enough to cover Maria's medical expenses and provide real security for our small family. What happened to that application? I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. It got lost in the system, Sarah said, and I could hear genuine regret in her voice. Our automated screening software flagged it for some technical issue. Something about incomplete documentation. By the time anyone realized the error, we'd already hired someone else for the position. Someone with half your qualifications who lasted exactly 6 months before leaving for a competitor. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. I'd been working security in the same building where I should have been running security, taking orders from supervisors who lacked a fraction of my training and experience. Meanwhile, the woman whose life I'd protected the night before had unknowingly been responsible for the bureaucratic failure that had derailed my career plans. Marcus, are you still there? I'm here, I said. Just processing this information. I know this must be frustrating to learn. If our systems had worked properly, you would have been in a completely different position when we met last night. You would have been my peer, not someone I was asking for help. Would that have changed anything? I asked. About last night, I mean. The question seemed to catch her off guard. I don't know, maybe, probably. It's hard to imagine the same situation playing out if you'd been wearing a suit instead of a security uniform. There was something in her tone that suggested she was grappling with her own assumptions about class, authority, and the invisible hierarchies that shaped human interaction. Sarah Chun had turned to me for help because I was there and willing to assist, not because she thought I was qualified to handle the situation. Learning about my background was forcing her to reconsider not just who I was, but how she evaluated people in general. Can I ask you something? I said, why does it matter now? The application, the missed opportunity, all of it. What's done is done. Because I don't think it has to stay done, Sarah replied. The position you applied for is currently vacant. Has been for 8 months since our last director left for a government position. I've been handling those responsibilities myself, which is part of why I was working so late last night. The implication hung in the air between us. Sarah Chun was offering me a chance to reclaim the career path that had been derailed by technological error and personal tragedy. It was an opportunity that could transform not just my professional life, but Diego's future as well. I need to think about this, I said. And I need to discuss it with my son. Any major change affects him too. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Marcus, I want you to know that last night showed me something important about character that no resume could have conveyed. The way you handled the situation, the instinctive professionalism, the genuine care for someone else's safety, those aren't qualities you can teach or train. They're part of who you are. After ending the call, I sat in my small apartment's kitchen, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline where Meridian Tower rose like a monument to possibilities I'd thought were lost forever. Diego was napping in the next room, his fever finally breaking, oblivious to the conversation that might change everything about our lives. The more I thought about Sarah's offer, the more complex it became. Accepting the position would mean better pay, professional respect, and the chance to use skills that had been dormant for too long. But it would also mean longer hours, more responsibility, and potentially less time with Diego during his formative years. There was another consideration too, one that felt more personal than professional. The connection I'd felt with Sarah Chun the night before had been real and unexpected. Learning that she owned the building, that she had the power to reshape my circumstances with a single decision, changed the dynamic between us in ways I wasn't sure how to navigate. When Diego woke up from his nap, his fever had broken and some color had returned to his cheeks. He found me still sitting at the kitchen table, lost in thought. "Dad, you look like you're trying to solve a really hard math problem," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "Something like that, buddy. How are you feeling?" "Better. My throat doesn't hurt as much, and I'm getting hungry," which Mom always said was a good sign when people are sick. The mention of Maria brought back memories of her practical wisdom and her ability to see potential in situations that looked impossible to others. She'd been the one to encourage me to apply for civilian positions that matched my military experience. She'd believed that my skills could translate into meaningful work in the corporate world. "Diego, what would you think if Dad got a different job? Still at the same building, but during the day instead of at night?" His face lit up with interest. "Would that mean you'd be home for dinner every night?" "It would mean I'd be home for dinner and available to help with homework and go to your soccer games without being tired from working all night." "That sounds awesome. But Dad, would you be happy doing something different?" The question caught me off guard with its perceptiveness. Diego had inherited more than his mother's eyes. He had her ability to cut through complications and focus on what really mattered. "I think I might be," I said honestly. "It would be a chance to use parts of my training that I haven't been able to use for a long time." "Then you should do it," Diego said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "Mom always said you were really good at helping people solve problems, and that you should find work that let you do that." As evening approached and Diego's health continued to improve, I found myself thinking more about Sarah's offer and what it might mean for both of us. The woman who'd sought protection in my lobby had turned out to be someone with the power to change my life completely. But more than that, she'd shown genuine remorse about the system failure that had derailed my career, and real appreciation for qualities that went beyond professional credentials. The offer felt less like charity and more like recognition of abilities that had been underutilized for too long. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt inevitable. I was going to call Sarah Chun and accept her offer, not just because it represented financial security or professional advancement, but because it felt like a chance to become who I was meant to be again. What I didn't realize was that accepting this position would put me in a place to discover just how much danger Sarah Chun was really in, and how much my specific skills would be needed to protect not just her safety, but her life. The transition from night security guard to director of corporate security felt surreal in ways I hadn't anticipated. 3 weeks after accepting Sarah's offer, I found myself sitting in a corner office on the 28th floor, reviewing threat assessments and security protocols instead of walking empty hallways with a flashlight. The view from my new workspace encompassed most of downtown Seattle, a dramatic shift from the lobby perspective I'd grown accustomed to during 18 months of overnight shifts. Diego had adapted to the change with the resilience that children possess when they sense their parents are genuinely happier. My new schedule meant I could walk him to school in the mornings, help with homework in the afternoons, and actually attend his soccer games without fighting exhaustion. The salary increase had eliminated the constant financial stress that had shadowed our lives since Maria's death, allowing us to move from our cramped apartment to a modest house with a yard where Diego could play. But the most significant change wasn't professional or financial. It was the growing connection between Sarah and me, a relationship that had evolved from crisis-driven gratitude into something deeper and more complex. Our working relationship required regular meetings, collaborative planning sessions, and the kind of professional intimacy that develops when two people discover they think about problems in similar ways. Sarah possessed a strategic mind that complemented my tactical training perfectly. Where I saw immediate threats and response protocols, she saw long-term patterns and systemic vulnerabilities. Our security meetings often stretched well beyond their scheduled time as we found ourselves discussing everything from risk management philosophy to the psychological profiles of potential threats. You approach problems differently than anyone I've worked with before, Sarah told me during one of our afternoon briefings. Most security professionals focus on physical barriers and technological solutions. You think about human behavior and psychological motivation. People are usually the weakest link in any security system, I replied. You can have the best locks, cameras, and alarm systems in the world, but if someone can manipulate a person into compromising those defenses, all the technology becomes irrelevant. Is that something you learned in the military? Partially, but mostly it comes from understanding that security isn't really about protecting buildings or information. It's about protecting people, and people are complicated. These conversations revealed layers of intelligence and insight that made me see Sarah as far more than just an employer or the woman I'd helped during a frightening night. She possessed a rare combination of business acuity and genuine empathy, someone who'd built a successful company without losing sight of her responsibility to the people who worked for her. The deeper I got into my new role, the more I understood why the previous director had struggled. Meridian Tower wasn't just an office building. It was a complex ecosystem housing dozens of companies, from tech startups to established law firms, each with unique security needs and risk profiles. The building attracted high-profile tenants, whose work often involved sensitive information, controversial legal cases, or valuable intellectual property. My military background had prepared me to assess threats systematically, but civilian corporate security required a different kind of analysis. Instead of enemy combatants, I was evaluating disgruntled former employees, industrial espionage attempts, and the kind of personal conflicts that could spill over into workplace violence. The stakes were different, but the fundamental challenge remained the same: anticipating problems before they became crises. Derek Paulson hadn't disappeared after his encounter with Officer Martinez. Instead, he'd evolved his approach, becoming more sophisticated in his harassment campaign against Sarah, rather than the obvious physical presence that had driven her to seek refuge in the lobby. He'd shifted to psychological warfare that was harder to document and nearly impossible to prosecute. He's been calling the office, Sarah told me during our weekly security review. Never says anything threatening directly, just asks questions about business hours, building access, whether I'll be attending various public events. Technically, he's not violating any laws, but the cumulative effect is that I feel like he's monitoring move. I'd been tracking Paulson's activities through a combination of building security footage, credit card records, and social media monitoring. The picture that emerged was disturbing in its calculated patience. He'd studied Sarah's routines with the dedication of someone conducting professional surveillance, learning her patterns without making himself obvious enough to warrant legal intervention. He's escalating, I explained to Sarah as we reviewed my findings. The initial stalking was impulsive, driven by whatever psychological trigger made him fixate on you. But now he's treating this like a long-term campaign. He's learned from the police encounter, adapted his methods, and settled in for what he expects to be an extended process. Extended process toward what? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications we both understood, but neither wanted to articulate. Stalking cases that progressed beyond initial infatuation rarely ended well for the victims. The psychological investment required to sustain months of obsessive behavior usually indicated someone who wasn't going to be deterred by conventional warnings or legal boundaries. We need to assume he's working toward some kind of direct confrontation. I said carefully, whether that's an attempt to force contact, workplace intrusion, or something more serious, we can't predict. But we can prepare for various scenarios. The preparation involved more than just updated security protocols. I'd begun conducting what amounted to protective intelligence, using resources and techniques I'd developed during military service to build a comprehensive threat profile. Paulson's background revealed a pattern of obsessive behavior toward women, including 2 previous restraining orders and a terminated employment history that suggested difficulty accepting authority or rejection. More concerning was his recent activity. Credit card records showed purchases of surveillance equipment, long-range photography gear, and what appeared to be materials for creating false identification documents. He wasn't just watching Sarah anymore. He was preparing for something more ambitious. I want to increase your personal security detail, I told Sarah after reviewing the latest intelligence. Not just building security, but protection during transit, at your residence, and during any public appearances. Marcus, I can't live like a prisoner because someone has decided to make me the focus of his delusions. I have a business to run, social obligations, a life that extends beyond these walls. I understand that. But I also understand that Paulson's behavior is escalating in ways that suggest imminent action rather than continued observation. We need to be proactive rather than reactive. The conversation revealed one of the fundamental tensions in protective work, the measures necessary to ensure someone's safety, often conflicted with their desire to maintain normalcy and independence. Sarah had built her success through calculated risk-taking and personal accessibility. My recommendations threatened to isolate her behind layers of security that would fundamentally change how she lived and worked. Our compromise involved discreet protection that enhanced her existing routines rather than restricting them. I arranged for plainclothes security during her commute, upgraded her residential alarm system, and implemented communication protocols that would allow immediate response to any threatening situation. But the most significant change was that I began personally overseeing her protection details, something that brought us into even closer contact. The increased time we spent together revealed aspects of Sarah's personality that her professional demeanor had previously concealed. She possessed a dry sense of humor that emerged during stressful situations, a way of finding absurdity in circumstances that might otherwise feel overwhelming. She was also remarkably observant about human behavior, often noticing details about people and situations that complemented my more systematic approach to threat assessment. You know, for someone who spent 12 years in the military, you're surprisingly gentle in how you handle people, Sarah observed as we reviewed security footage together one afternoon. I would have expected more of the stereotypical alpha male approach. Special Forces training focuses heavily on working with local populations, I explained. You learn quickly that intimidation and aggression usually create more problems than they solve. Most situations can be de-escalated through patience and understanding rather than force. Is that how you approached parenthood too? The personal question caught me off guard. Our conversations had gradually become more intimate as we worked together, but Sarah rarely asked direct questions about my life outside of work. Diego's mother was the one who taught me about gentleness, I said. Maria had this ability to see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. She believed that most behavioral problems came from fear or pain rather than malice, and that addressing the underlying cause was more effective than punishing the symptoms. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was. She would have liked you, actually. Maria always said that the most interesting people were those who used their power to lift others up rather than to assert dominance. The comment seemed to affect Sarah more than I'd expected. She was quiet for several minutes, studying the security monitors with unusual intensity. "Can I tell you something?" she said finally. When I first inherited this building, I was 26 years old and completely unprepared for the responsibility. My father had built Chun Properties from nothing, but he died suddenly before he could teach me how to run it. I spent the first few years making decisions based on what I thought a CEO should do rather than what actually needed to be done. What changed? I realized that the building wasn't really mine. It belonged to all the people who worked here, who built their careers and lives around the stability I was supposed to provide. That changed how I thought about everything, from tenant relations to employee benefits to security protocols. That's why you corrected the error with my application. It wasn't just about hiring someone qualified. It was about fixing a system that had failed someone who deserved better. Exactly. And it's why I take Paulson's threats so seriously. This isn't just about my personal safety. It's about ensuring that everyone who works here feels secure and protected. As autumn deepened into winter, Paulson's activities became more brazen and more concerning. He'd begun appearing at locations where Sarah conducted business, always maintaining legal distance but making his presence obvious enough to be psychologically unsettling. Coffee shops, restaurants, professional conferences, anywhere Sarah might reasonably be expected to appear, Paulson would materialize in the background. The breakthrough came when our surveillance team caught him attempting to gain unauthorized access to the building's service areas. Security cameras recorded him trying various employee entrances, testing door handles, and studying the building's exterior architecture with the systematic attention of someone planning an intrusion. He's moved from observation to preparation. I told Sarah as we reviewed the footage. This represents a significant escalation in threat level. We're no longer dealing with someone who's content to watch from a distance. What do you think he's planning? Access. He wants to get closer to you than public spaces allow. Whether that's to deliver some kind of message, force a confrontation, or something worse, we can't determine. But his behavior suggests he's preparing to act within the next few weeks. The timing couldn't have been worse. Sarah had several important business meetings scheduled, including a major investor presentation that would determine the future expansion of Chun Properties. Canceling or relocating these commitments would signal weakness to business partners and potentially damage deals that had taken months to arrange. We'll maintain the schedule, Sarah decided after careful consideration, but we'll implement the highest level of security protocols. I refuse to let Derek Paulson dictate how I run my business or live my life. What neither of us realized was that Paulson had been planning something far more sophisticated than simple building intrusion. He'd spent months studying not just Sarah's routines, but the security systems designed to protect her. And he'd identified a vulnerability that even my military training hadn't anticipated, one that would put both Sarah and Diego in immediate danger. The crisis came on a Thursday evening in December, just as Seattle's early winter darkness was settling over the city. I was reviewing final security preparations for Sarah's investor presentation the following morning when my phone rang with a call that made my blood turn to ice. "Dad?" Diego's voice was small and frightened, barely above a whisper. "There's a man outside our house. He's been walking back and forth for like 20 minutes, and he keeps looking at my bedroom window." I was already reaching for my keys before Diego finished speaking. "Where are you right now, buddy?" "In my closet with the cordless phone. Dad, I'm scared. Mom always said if something felt wrong, I should trust that feeling. Your mom was absolutely right. Diego, I need you to stay exactly where you are and keep the phone with you. I'm calling the police right now, and I'll be there in 15 minutes. Do not open the door for anyone. Do not turn on any lights. And if the man tries to come inside, you call 911 immediately." The realization hit me like a physical blow as I raced through the empty corridors toward the parking garage. Derek Paulson hadn't just been studying Sarah's routines and security protocols. He'd been researching everyone connected to her, including the man who'd become her primary protector. Somehow he'd identified my home address and discovered that targeting my son would be far more devastating than any direct attack on Sarah herself. This wasn't random escalation. It was sophisticated psychological warfare designed to neutralize me by forcing me to choose between protecting Sarah and protecting Diego. Paulson had correctly calculated that no father would prioritize professional duty over his child's safety, no matter how important the work or how strong the commitment. I called 911 while speeding through downtown Seattle traffic, reporting a suspicious person near my residence and requesting immediate patrol response. Then I called Sarah, knowing that whatever Paulson was planning for Diego was likely a diversion from his primary objective. "Marcus, what's wrong?" Sarah's voice was alert with concern. "Paulson is at my house, threatening my son. This isn't coincidental timing. He's trying to draw me away from you before your presentation tomorrow. You need to implement lockdown protocols immediately and get to the secure floor until I can assess the full situation." "Forget the lockdown protocols. I'm coming with you." "Sarah, absolutely not. If this is a diversion tactic, then putting yourself in a secondary location is exactly what he wants. And if this isn't a diversion, if he's actually threatening an innocent child to get at me, then I'm not hiding in a safe room while Diego is in danger because of my problems." The argument continued as I navigated through evening traffic, but I could hear the determination in Sarah's voice that brooked no compromise. She'd made her decision based on the same protective instincts that were driving my desperate race across the city. Neither of us was willing to let someone else pay the price for Paulson's obsession. When I arrived at my neighborhood, police cars were already positioned strategically around my block. Officer Martinez, the same veteran cop who dealt with Paulson's initial stalking behavior, met me at the corner. "The subject is no longer visible from the street," she reported. "But we found evidence of extended surveillance. Cigarette butts, food containers, and what appears to be a detailed sketch of your home's layout, hidden in the bushes across the street. Where's my son?" "Still inside, still safe. We've established communication through the neighbor's house and confirmed he's secure in his hiding place. But Rivera, this guy has been watching your home for weeks, maybe months. He knows your routines, your son's schedule, everything about how you live." The violation felt worse than any physical attack. Paulson had turned my home, the sanctuary where Diego should feel completely safe, into a surveillance target. Every evening I'd spent helping with homework. Every weekend morning we'd played in the yard. Every moment of normalcy we'd built after Maria's death had been observed and cataloged by someone planning to use that information as a weapon. Sarah arrived just as the tactical team was preparing to sweep the house and surrounding area. Against all protocol and despite my vigorous objections, she'd driven herself across the city to be present for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "This is my fault," she said as we watched officers move into position. "Diego is in danger because Paulson is obsessed with me. I should have found a way to end this before it reached your family. This is Paulson's fault," I corrected. "Nobody else bears responsibility for the actions of someone who chooses to terrorize innocent people." The tactical sweep revealed that Paulson was no longer on the property, but the evidence of his surveillance was extensive and chilling. Hidden cameras positioned to monitor both the front and back of the house. Detailed schedules tracking Diego's movements to and from school. Photographs of our daily routines taken with telephoto lenses from multiple concealed positions. Most disturbing was a notebook containing what appeared to be operational planning notes. Paulson had been developing multiple scenarios for gaining access to Diego, each one more elaborate than the last. The final entry, dated that morning, outlined a plan to use my son as leverage to force Sarah into an isolated meeting where Paulson could act out whatever fantasies had been driving his months of obsessive behavior. "Dad," Diego's voice cut. through my analysis of Paulson's surveillance materials as he emerged from the house with a police escort. Despite his fear, he ran directly to me with the absolute trust that children reserve for parents who've never failed to protect them. "Are you okay, buddy?" I asked, kneeling to his eye level and checking for any signs of trauma or injury. "I was scared, but I remembered what you taught me about staying calm during emergencies. And Dad, I think I saw where the man went when the police cars came." Diego's observation proved crucial. He'd noticed Paulson retreating not toward the street where police would expect someone to flee, but toward the wooded area behind our neighborhood that connected to a series of hiking trails. More importantly, Diego had seen Paulson carrying what appeared to be a large backpack, suggesting he was prepared for extended time away from civilization. "He's not running randomly," I told Officer Martinez as we studied topographical maps of the area. "He's got a destination in mind, somewhere he can regroup and continue his campaign from a position of advantage." The breakthrough came when Sarah's security team reported unusual activity near one of her secondary properties, a small conference facility in the hills outside Seattle that Chen Properties used for executive retreats. Motion sensors had detected movement in areas that should have been vacant, and security cameras showed someone tampering with external lighting systems. "That's where he's going," Sarah said with certainty. "The facility is isolated, has multiple access points, and contains detailed information about my business operations and personal schedule. If he's been planning some kind of final confrontation, that location gives him everything he needs." The decision to pursue Paulson ourselves rather than waiting for law enforcement backup was driven by urgency and intimate knowledge of the threat he posed. Police protocols required extensive coordination and approval processes that could take hours to implement. Meanwhile, Paulson was establishing himself in a position where he could continue terrorizing our lives indefinitely. "I'm going with you," Sarah announced as I prepared tactical gear I hadn't used since leaving the military. "This isn't a business meeting or a security consultation. This is potentially lethal force against someone who's demonstrated willingness to threaten children to achieve his objectives. Which is exactly why I need to be there. Marcus, this only ends when Paulson understands that I'm not going to be intimidated into submission. Running and hiding just validates his belief that he has power over my life." Diego stayed with Officer Martinez and her partner, secured in a safe location with explicit instructions to contact federal authorities if we didn't return within 2 hours. As we drove toward the conference facility, I found myself thinking about Maria and the conversations we'd had about protecting the people we loved without becoming consumed by the violence that threats sometimes required. The facility sat on 20 acres of forested hillside, a collection of modern buildings designed to blend with the natural environment while providing state-of-the-art meeting spaces for corporate events. Under normal circumstances, it was peaceful and welcoming. Tonight, with Paulson somewhere in the darkness, it felt like walking into a carefully prepared trap. "Motion sensors show he's in the main conference building," I reported after checking the security monitoring station. "But he's disabled most of the interior cameras, which means he's been planning this location as a fallback position for weeks. What's his endgame? What does he think he's going to accomplish by luring us here?" Control. Paulson's entire campaign has been about demonstrating that he can dictate your actions, invade your privacy, and force you to respond to his agenda. This confrontation is supposed to be his ultimate validation. We approached the main building using techniques I'd learned during urban warfare training, moving carefully through shadows and maintaining constant communication. Sarah proved surprisingly adept at tactical movement, following my directions precisely and showing none of the panic that civilian population typically exhibited in high-stress situations. The confrontation, when it came, was both more and less dramatic than I'd anticipated. Paulson had positioned himself in the main conference room, surrounded by photographs, documents, and personal items he'd somehow acquired during his months of surveillance. The display looked like a shrine to his obsession, complete with detailed plans for restructuring Sarah's life according to his delusions. "I knew you'd come," he said calmly as we entered the room. "Both of you. That's what makes this perfect." Paulson looked different than he had during his street surveillance, more focused and determined. He'd crossed whatever psychological boundary had previously restrained him from direct action, and his demeanor carried the dangerous unpredictability of someone who no longer cared about consequences. "Derek, this ends tonight," Sarah said with remarkable composure. "Whatever you think you're accomplishing, whatever you believe gives you the right to terrorize innocent people, it stops here." "You don't understand," Paulson replied, gesturing toward his elaborate display. "I've been protecting you, watching over you, making sure you were safe from all the people who might hurt you." The twisted logic was classic stalker psychology. The delusion that harassment and invasion of privacy constituted care and protection. Paulson genuinely believed that his months of terrorizing Sarah had been acts of devotion rather than aggression. "Derek," I said, using the calm voice I'd developed for crisis negotiation, "I understand that you believe you care about Sarah, but caring about someone means respecting their choices and their autonomy. What you've been doing is the opposite of protection." "You don't know her like I do," Paulson said, his agitation increasing. "You don't see how vulnerable she is, how much she needs someone who truly understands her value." The negotiation continued for nearly an hour, with Paulson alternating between rational conversation and increasingly erratic behavior. Throughout the exchange, Sarah remained remarkably steady, neither provoking him nor showing the fear that might have escalated his delusions. The resolution came when Paulson finally realized that his months of planning and surveillance had achieved nothing except demonstrating his own powerlessness. Sarah wasn't going to be intimidated into submission. I wasn't going to be neutralized by threats to my family. And his elaborate confrontation was going to end with him in police custody rather than in control of the situation he'd tried so desperately to orchestrate. When law enforcement arrived, Paulson surrendered without resistance, the fight finally gone out of him as reality replaced fantasy. The evidence we'd gathered, combined with his own detailed documentation of stalking activities, provided prosecutors with everything needed for serious criminal charges that would likely result in both imprisonment and mandatory psychological treatment. 6 months later, Diego and I attended Sarah's wedding to a software entrepreneur she'd met during a business conference in Portland. The ceremony was held in the same conference facility where we'd confronted Derek Paulson, transformed from a place of fear into a celebration of new beginnings. "Dad, does this mean Sarah's going to be like a stepmother?" Diego asked as we watched the couple exchange vows. "No, buddy. Sarah's going to be Sarah, which is exactly what makes her special." The events had changed all of us in ways that went beyond the obvious. Sarah had learned that true security came from surrounding herself with people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. I'd rediscovered that my skills and experience had value beyond military applications, that protecting people could be as much about emotional support as physical security. Most importantly, Diego had learned that families could expand and evolve without diminishing the love that held them together. Sarah never tried to replace Maria in our lives, but she brought her own warmth and wisdom that enriched our small family in unexpected ways. The security company we eventually founded together combined Sarah's business expertise with my tactical experience, creating an organization that specialized in protecting people from the kind of sophisticated threats that traditional security companies often missed. Our first major client was Chin Properties, but our reputation for handling complex personal security cases soon attracted clients from across the Pacific Northwest. Derek Paulson completed his sentence and underwent court-mandated psychological treatment. We never heard from him again, though Sarah occasionally wondered whether our confrontation had provided him with a reality check. He needed to address his underlying issues. The night security guard who'd once protected a building owner from a stalker had become something neither of us had expected: partners in business, protectors of each other's dreams, and proof that the most important help sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.